Welcome, everybody. As we let the last several hundred participants file in, we're going to start our program tonight. Welcome to this, the sixth program in our series, America at a Crossroads. Tonight, we welcome David Brooks and Warren Olney into our homes for what promises to be a stimulating conversation on a very interesting day. We especially welcome those who have joined us for the first time. This series is a joint undertaking of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., two organizations which share a commitment to the preservation of our Constitution and our democratic ideals. Together, we have presented more than 20 programs of exceptional quality, bringing some of America's most astute observers and thinkers to you. Our goal is to ensure that we never grow accustomed to the chaos in our midst and to the threats and dangers growing on a daily basis to our Constitution and democratic ideals. Our mission is to help our listeners stay motivated, mobilized, and informed so as to be effective agents of the changes that must be made in our country. And for Judge Jews United, we speak as a Jewish voice. We see American constitutional democratic values and Jewish values as remarkably consistent and in dire need of our attention and protection. This week, staying safe has new meaning. We not only mourn the additional 10,000 American lives lost this week to COVID-19, but we also mourn the death of George Floyd and support those who are peacefully protesting the racial bias which has been on display in the killings and unjust treatment of so many Black Americans. It is ever so timely that 2 weeks from tonight, we will welcome Mayor Eric Garcetti, who will speak about the multiple crises our city faces: COVID, economic freefall, racial tension, civic unrest. Join us to hear Mayor Garcetti governing in this time of crisis. Where are we and where do we go from here? We ask that you register as soon as possible. The link will be emailed to you as soon as the program is over tonight. On behalf of Community Advocates, Inc., and the leadership of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, David Lehrer, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and Caroline Kelly. We thank our co-sponsors who are Leo Beck Temple, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Valley Beth Shalom, Ikar, Stephen Wise Temple, Jewish Center for Justice, and The Forward. We thank our donors who help to underwrite these programs, and feel free to contribute. You can send me an email. When you get an email from Judge, just respond and I'll be able to instruct you how to do that. Donations are tax deductible. And thanks to my amazing colleague, David Lehrer, for all that you have invested in this series and overall in the fight for democracy. I'll now hand the program over to David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. On behalf of Community Advocates, I'm pleased to join her in welcoming you to America at a Crossroads, our virtual town hall series. The responses exceeded our expectations by leaps and bounds. We did not expect an audience of thousands each week. Clearly, people are concerned and interested in learning, and you prove it by your presence tonight. We continue with our run of amazing speakers. We'll be hearing an analysis of recent events from the person I would most like to listen to in the vast universe of pundits, David Brooks. In future weeks, we will host two of the nation's top legal scholars, UC Berkeley Law School's Dean Erwin Chemerinsky and UCLA Law School Dean Jennifer Mnookin. They will discuss the Constitution crisis, along with former legal analyst for the LA Times, Henry Weinstein. And on July 1st, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, will address anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate in the age of Trump, the timeliest of topics. This is a program you won't want to miss. I will be questioning Jonathan that evening. A reminder, you'll be able to pose questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. However, with an audience that had 1,700 registrants, we can't guarantee that your question will be asked. Once again tonight, for his third appearance in our series, is our good friend Warren Olney, a Los Angeles treasure. He is the host and executive producer of To The Point and To The Point's Climate Change Update, podcast based on his years of experience as a journalist in print, commercial TV, and public broadcasting. He formerly hosted KCRW's Which Way LA and the nationally syndicated To The Point. He is the recipient of nearly 40 national, regional, and local awards for broadcast excellence, from Emmys to Golden Mikes, including the Radio and Television News Association's Lifetime Achievement Award. Warren?
That I was so glad that Janice mentioned George Floyd, because I want to add my name to those who are grieving over what happened a week and a half ago in Minnesota. In the meantime, David Brooks with us tonight, veteran of reporting, veteran of opining in print, on radio, and on TV. He's gone from the Wall Street Journal to the Weekly Standard to the PBS NewsHour to All Things Considered on NPR. Since 2003, he's been an op-ed columnist at the New York Times. We all know that. He's written books, including Bobos in Paradise, most recently, The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life. And David, it's great to be with you again, and thanks a lot for doing this tonight.
It's great to be with you again.
Well, the theme of this is when and why the Trump ploy stopped working. Let me give you a couple of minutes at the top of the show to talk about that and tell us how you would address that idea today, knowing full well that things change so fast you might have to say something different tomorrow.
Well, things have changed since I wrote that column, though I will note that Joe Biden is now up by 11 percentage points. So there's some sign the Trump ploy is not working. Let me just talk for maybe 5 or 7 or 8 minutes just about how I see things, and then we can have a conversation. First, it's a pleasure to be with my friend David Lair. We had a conversation I was recalling years and years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago, about free will and whether we believed in it. And I recall at the time David didn't, and now I wish I didn't, because it would be nice not to have free will at this moment. And just to say what a pleasure it is to be back on with Warren, just to hear your voice calms me down. We've been appearing together for 25 years, I think, probably since my first appearance on KCRW. And it just soothes me. I'm calm. So I'm going to call you in the middle of the night next time I have an anxiety attack. So let me start with the historian, political scientist, Huntington of Harvard, who died a few years ago. He wrote a book in 1981 arguing that America, every 60 years or so, has a moral convulsion. And he says American history moves forward in these moral convulsions. And one happened in 1770, in the time of our creation. It happened in 1830 with Andrew Jackson. It happened in 1890 with the Progressive Movement. It happened in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, the Woodstock and the Peace Movement, feminism. And in 1981, Huntington argued that right about 2020, we're going to have another moral convulsion. And I'd say we've had that. We're in the middle of one. And I would say it started 3 or 4 years ago in the Trump revolution, political polarization. And so the way I see this current moment, it's like having a hurricane in the middle of an earthquake. The earthquake is the shock, permanent shock to our system that has opened up all sorts of divides in our society. And there are racial divides, there are political divides, there are economic divides. And we are just a fundamentally divided society in all sorts of ways. And then you introduce a pandemic, which is the hurricane. And the hurricane pours water into all those divides and it exposes them for what they are, but then forces a change in them. And I've been looking through this crisis as a matter of social trust. Can we trust one another to be effective in dealing with a pandemic? Can we trust each other to be effective in dealing with a crisis of racial? And we used to be a high trust society. America is one of the most trusting societies in the world. The World War II generation, if you ask them, do you trust American institutions? 80% said yes. American government, American institutions can be trustworthy. That's now down to about 19%. We used to be have trust for each other. If you ask people, can you trust your neighbors? Then it used to be, 60% said, yeah, I can trust my neighbors. Now it's down to 33%. And marginalized groups, for obvious and legitimate reasons, are low in trust. There are 3 communities in our society that are low in trust for very good reasons. The first are African Americans. They have low trust in institutions because American society has not been fair to them. The second is less educated white working class. The economy has not been good to them. And the third, and the least trusting group in American society right now, is young people. If you ask people under 35, can most people be trusted? 65% say no. If you ask them, are people basically selfish and out for themselves? 72% say, yes, they are, just selfish. And so young people have been screwed by a world that has not treated them well, both economically and just culturally. And they have not seen a lot of success from the financial crisis to the Trump election to the Iraq war. They just have not seen anything to tell them that America is a society that's basically trustworthy. And the crucial thing about the next 2 years is that their sense of society, one sense of society, is it trustworthy or not, that's locked in by age 35. And you basically carry that attitude with you for the rest of your life. So either the distrust of the younger generation is about to be confirmed, in which case we'll have a distrustful generation for decades, or it's about to be reversed, a sense, no, we can trust each other. We can pull together in a time of crisis. And so that's the part of the pivotal nature of this moment. Now, I have to say, in the first weeks of the pandemic, we saw institutional collapse. We were behind on everything. Complete failure of leadership from the White House in really contemptible ways. But we did see trust rise, and that's because if you looked at communities, people saw each other showing up for each other. They saw the local church or synagogue, which was offering food pantry. They saw the local restaurant giving food for the poor. And so what you saw in the first surveys that were done, do you trust people more? Trust went up 10%. Do you trust government? Yes, I need government. Do we trust each other? Are we more united or are we more divided? 42%, yeah, we're more united. And only 23% said we're more divided. So you saw this rise of society, not government, but society rising up and people showing up for each other. Second phase, we had this debate over how quickly we should open, and we're still having it. And the polarized voices on left and right gave you the impression the Republicans were all for opening and the Democrats were all for lockdown. That is not the way the country was. The elites, a few polarized voices were polarized, but 77% of Americans supported the lockdowns. 82% supported what the Congress did. 80% thought we're going to need more government aid down the road. In a polarized society, we just never see this. So politically, America really came together more than before. And so in the first few weeks of the pandemic, I thought Donald Trump is a disaster. The CDC has screwed this up. American society is actually doing a pretty good job of this. So I was ready to tell a good news story. And then we have the events of the last week. To me, the last week was the worst week of our collective lifetimes. We had 100,000 deaths. We had an economic collapse. We had a renewed evidence of racial injustice. And it was just a body blow, and remains a body blow for a lot of us. As one of my colleagues said, it's like having 1968, we had riots, 1918, a flu, 1932, a depression, and having all those 3 years all at once. And so will we come through it? Again, it's like watching Lord of the Rings. The forces of trust who are protesting aggressively but safely are inspiring. The looting, to me, it's just stealing. And it undermines trust, and it undermines people's sense of order and sends people into a panic. And so we're watching these forces. And I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I do know what I would love to see. And I'll close on this. I think it's time for reparations. I've argued once in the past, but I think it's time for reparations now as a show of respect to African Americans. But the way you do reparations is careful. I don't think it would make sense to try to track down who's a descendant of a slave and send them $1,000. I don't think that would produce any lasting good. But I do think we can help communities. You can take every neighborhood that was redlined and you can invest a lot in that community. You can take every neighborhood of condensed poverty and you can invest in that a lot in that community. Just before we shut down, I spent a few days in Compton and Watts in the South Central District of LA. I spent an afternoon with a woman who runs something called Sisters of Watts. And she was spending her whole life in Watts. And you know what I learned about her? She's lived in Watts. If you want to know how to save Watts, ask her. Give money to her, give power to her. I ran into a guy named Barack in Compton who runs an educational program. He lives on the streets of Compton. And so to me, the reparations should take the form of giving money and power to people in those communities and say, you know your communities, you know what's best to create a more racially just and a more equal world. And to me, that's the way forward. And I basically have faith in America. I've seen how America has responded to this COVID, I think pretty well. And I've seen how they have really unified, not around the rioting, but around the basic injustice that we now see. And I'm hopeful that, as awful as this period has been, and it's been, as I say, a body blow, I'm hopeful that we learn from our experiences and show an ability to move as one, as a people. And in a year, we'll be surprised how much better things look.
David, I've heard a lot of people talk about the possibility of reparations, never in quite the terms that you discussed it. Obviously, it would have to come as a policy from Washington with the Congress and the president going along with it. How much support do you think you would get, even from young people, for reparations at this point, particularly at a time when government is so mistrusted, to use your term, by so many people?
Yeah, well, first, if it's Donald Trump is reelected, we're not going to have reparations. Sure. But every single Democratic candidate, including Mike Bloomberg and everybody to his left, was at least in favor of a commission. And part of that commission is just to say it was wrong. What's happened is wrong. It's just an official acknowledgement that it was wrong. That itself is an important thing. And if you go back to Ta-Nehisi Coates' original piece, The Case for Reparations, that's what he was talking about. I think we have to go further. And I think if we said, okay, we're going to try to track the genetic code of whoever was an ancestor of a slave and we're going to give them money, I think there'd be no support for that.
When Joe Biden
say this is about the future, not the past. Sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to ask you this. When Joe Biden started campaigning this year, reportedly, he told his donors, don't worry about it. I'm not going to do anything to shake things up. And now he is saying he wants to be like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and having a very different attitude. Do you think that that's going to be something that will help him get elected, or will it scare the hell out of people?
Well, you know, people don't trust government and they don't trust Washington.
No.
And so if he said, I'm going to centralize all this power in Washington, I do think that would scare people. And you have to remember how fragile a lot of these leads are and how, he's got this big lead right now, 11 percentage points. But, the riots in 68, Tom Edsall has a piece in my newspaper today, quoting political scientists who firmly believe that they cost Hubert Humphrey the election of 1968. And Hubert Humphrey was the classic Democrat of his age. Joe Biden is the classic Democrat of his age. And so that's up in the air. But I would say people want action, they want change, but you have to follow the rivers of trust. You have to go where people trust. And people do not trust Washington right now, but they do trust state governments. A lot of governors right now have 82% approval. They trust their locality. So what Washington can do is use its power and its money to give local people more power and money. And so some of it can just come in the form of a venture philanthropy grant, so they give money to community builders. Some of it can be form of national service program. So people can be young people who are going to have no jobs and no travel and no college. They can spend 2 years serving America in local communities. Some of it can just be building. I'm really struck by the power of the progressive movement. And they took a society kind of like ours, with a lot of political corruption, a lot of political division, a lot of concentration of wealth, and they sort of fixed it. They did a good job, and if we did half as well, we'd be happy. One of the things they did is built libraries. Like, there are libraries all across America built by state funds, and they're tremendous community centers. Right now, we're about to have a lot of empty shopping malls and retail spaces. Suppose we gave that over and had them serve community as spaces where community could come together. If we have the initiative to think positively, I do think not a centralized New Deal, but a lot of local efforts funded by the federal government could do some good.
You said that a lot of people are very favorably inclined toward their governors. President Trump lectured the governors and told them they had to dominate. Do you think that people are going to respond favorably to that idea and the extension of it, which turned out to be a threat to put military troops on the streets of American cities?
Yeah, I wouldn't. A lot of us who live more in progressive areas think that's something nobody would support. But I saw a poll yesterday that 58% of Americans would support that. Yeah. And so disorder, people vote against disorder. I think Peter Beinart, I think is coming in your series, had an article years ago that people tend to vote for the candidate who seems more orderly. Barack Obama, in the midst of the financial crisis, seemed more orderly than John McCain. So people like order. They don't expect much from government, but don't create chaos. And if Donald Trump, I don't think it'll come to that, but if Donald Trump said we're going to use troops, I would oppose it, and I think most of the military would oppose it, but a lot of Americans would support it.
I have in my hand an extraordinary statement that was made today by Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense. It's headlined, "In Union There Is Strength." It appears in the Atlantic magazine, and it's absolutely extraordinary for a former cabinet minister, let alone a former Secretary of Defense, to say the kinds of things that he did. He said, "We must reject any thinking of our cities as battle state that our uniformed military is called on to dominate. That creates a false conflict between the military and civilian society." He says, "Donald Trump is the first president of my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, who does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We're witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We're witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him." How powerful a statement do you think that's going to be in the election coming up?
I think it'll ring with a lot of military people. If there's anybody who is admired in the Marine Corps and beyond the Marine Corps, it's General Mattis. I've gotten to know him, and I've heard him say such things in private. And he always had said, "I'm not going to say it. The time is not right for me to say it in public." But it doesn't surprise me that he would do this hard but honorable thing and say the truth that I think he saw. And I think one of the things and this goes back to Republican senators. What General Mattis said is what they believe. And they've been doing this twisting body language for 3 years to avoid saying the truth, what they know to be the truth. Because to be around Donald Trump, as General Mattis has been, is to know that this is the truth. And so I hope, and frankly, it's becoming a little politically opportune for Republican senators to admit this truth. And everything I've heard from Trump administration officials is it's worse than you think. It's always worse than you think. And I would say that over the past 3 weeks, it's gotten even worse it's gotten publicly worse than it was 3 weeks before, or 3 weeks before, 3 weeks before. And this has been, I wrote a piece called If Only We Had a Leader. And it was about what America would be like if we had a normal president who could step outside his political role and suffer with us, who could sympathize with the African-American community and what they've been through, who could call on our common sources of culture. Robert Kennedy quoted Aeschylus when Martin Luther King was killed. Abraham Lincoln quoted the American founding. These are the things that unite us and deepen our response. They don't walk out in front of a church and hold the Bible upside down.
Hold the Bible up like it's a box of soap in a TV commercial. It was remarkable the way that picture came off. You mentioned the other Republicans. Not even Mitt Romney, who was the only Republican to vote for impeachment, has spoken out in the last few days. He, like so many of the rest, has gone away from the cameras, gone into the door, pretended not to hear the question, whatever, and hasn't had anything to say. How many of them do you think are in sufficient trouble that there might in fact be a Republican Senate, a Democratic Senate?
Yeah. First, I'm giving Mitt Romney a pass because nobody else has done anything, and he's come out a couple times and criticized President Trump.
Well,
so
does he just still deserve
I got no criticism for Mitt Romney. He doesn't have to do it every day. He's made clear what he thinks, and the president has made clear what he thinks of Mitt Romney. I will say, talking to Republicans, they expect to lose the presidency. They expect to lose the Senate. They expect to pick up seats in the House, but not enough to carry a majority. That would be the conventional wisdom among Republicans right now. And if you look at the polling, that's very much borne out. I mean, one of the things I looked at was a series of polls that showed Hillary Clinton how she polled in swing states, Hillary Clinton how she did in swing states, and Joe Biden and how he's polling in these swing states. And in every state, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Joe Biden is significantly outperforming how Hillary Clinton polled and how she did. And you've just seen bleeding away for among older voters because of the COVID. He's not handling that well. You've seen bleeding away among religious voters. And I will say I have a lot of friends who are evangelical Christians, and a lot of the evangelical Christians who supported Trump were offended by what happened the other day in front of the church at Lafayette Square. It was such a blatant manipulation and misuse of scripture that it filled them with contempt. And even those who admired Donald Trump. And, you know, I would call attention for those who have not seen it to Tucker Carlson did a 30-minute tirade. There's a very interesting thing on the right going on between Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson on Fox. Sean Hannity is a complete Trump follower. Tucker Carlson is turning into a complete Trump critic because he doesn't do much for working class America. And that's been an interesting divide. And the future of the Republican Party is more Tucker Carlson than it is Sean Hannity.
Speaking of working class Americans, you said at the outset that we're in a moral convulsion. It was actually predicted in 1981, the first year of the Reagan administration, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not. What happened in the meantime, do you think? And to what extent were the Democrats responsible for it just as much as Republicans have been?
In 1991, I was working for the Wall Street Journal. And if anybody remembers those days, there was a coup in Russia, the former Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia, and tanks came in, and Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank in front of the Russian parliament building, what they called the White House, and he stood down the coup. On that day, I interviewed a lady in that square who was 93, who had been in the household of the Tsar, who had lost her first husband in the civil war that followed the Russian Revolution, who had lost her second husband in the Battle of Stalingrad, I think, who had lost two of her sons in World War II, who had lost her third husband when he only disappeared and went to the Gulag in the 1950s. And she herself was a member of the Kalmyk people, and Khrushchev expelled them all. She had seen the entire travesty of totalitarianism in Russia from 1917 to the end in 1991. And I remember that day interviewing her, thinking, it really was the end of history. Globalization is here. In 20 years, I covered in Mandela coming out of prison, South Africa. I covered the Oslo peace process. I covered the unification of Europe. It seemed like borders were coming down. We could all be peaceful and affluent in a globalized world. And that was a naive globalization. We were wrong about people. We were underestimated how much bad people would take advantage of this to steal things, especially in Russia. We underestimated the power of the economy to be fair. We underestimated the power of technology to bring us together rather than drive us apart. A whole series of things we underestimated. We did not see how people at the top of society would concentrate their efforts to lock in their gains and privileges. And so if you're these young people with low trust, you've been living with failed globalization. And to me, that's the era of disappointment. We've had disappointment for 25 years. At the end of my time in Europe, I covered the Yugoslav Civil War, Milosevic and Serbia and Bosnia. That was the most important event I covered. In the ensuing 25 years, this has been the story of ethnic rivalry, of nationalism, of division, of walls. And so this has been a hard period for humanity. And I certainly believed in it. I think Democrats, Republicans, everybody was part of the system. And the 90s turned out to be a false dawn. And the Clinton era turned out to be a false dawn. And so I don't blame anybody. I blame we all. Maybe there was some dissonance on the left and right. And now that system is collapsing. And we're finding people either on the right, the ethnic populists, or on the left, the Bernie Sanders class populists. They're saying, let's get rid of that. We got something else. And people like me think, well, I kind of like parts of globalization, but how do we reform it and preserve it so it actually works, which it doesn't right now.
We have promised that our audience will be able to ask questions, and they are beginning to pour in. As David said at the outset, I'm not at all sure we'll be able to get all of them asked, but I want to turn my time over now to others who have some very interesting things to ask. And one of them is this: how much confidence do you have that President Trump would actually vacate the Oval Office if he were defeated in November?
Yeah, I do have confidence in that. And I say that because he has no admirers, even in the White House. And if he had ruled by charisma frankly, if he'd been an effective authoritarian, then I think maybe he would cling to office and some people will follow him. But I think when he loses, almost everybody will be very happy to wash their hands of him, including people in the Trump administration, people around him, and certainly people in the military. And so I have confidence in his, if he loses, his coming solitude. And I don't think there'll be any apparatus to support him in trying to do that.
You've talked about young people, you've talked about reparations. Somebody asked, would free tuition be part of the reparations?
It could be. I mean, the one thing that is baby bonds, which is to give people money at birth that they could spend on education. I do think, you know, when you look at millennials, and one of the reasons they're disappointed, their income levels are way higher than any other generation. Their education levels are way higher. But two things are just knocking them down. It's the cost of education, the cost of housing. And so maybe making education less expensive would be, if it was done right. And one of the reasons I don't like free college is that it makes the state colleges free, but it ends up decimating for the private colleges. So I don't think that's the way to do it. But I do think if you lower those costs, that is one of the gigantic costs. It's not enough. If you look at why people don't continue college, it's surprisingly little is because they can't afford it, like 9%. It's because they're not been academically prepared to do college work, or else some life event happens. So we need to do a lot more to get people through college than make it free.
Nobody knows better than Donald Trump the power of a single image. Somebody wants to know, will his performance at the church be similar to the impact of Dukakis riding in that tank?
It certainly, it was just, you know, if he, you know, everyone's saying that he now should have read a passage, and now Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, Andrew Cuomo are reading passages of the Bible, which is great. I love to see the Bible read in public. If he had read a passage, I think one of the odd things about him is that he doesn't do laughter. He doesn't do empathy. He's incapable of loving and being loved. And to read a passage that expresses mourning, expresses empathy, that, you know, you go to the Psalms, and the Psalms begin with lamentation and vulnerability. And with a few exceptions, they end with faith. They end with the rock. And I don't think Trump can do the vulnerability. I've been reading Isaiah a lot these days. I found, you know, it's a useful reminder that we've been through hard times, that we've strayed, we've been through hard times. There's I'm about to mispronounce his name, Habakkuk, and forget one of the prophets. And he has a beautiful passage, which I want to quote somewhere, which says, "You have put yourself above others. You've built your houses above others, and punishment comes." And we don't believe this is punishment. We don't believe that. But that phrase, "you put your house above others," that's a useful phrase to think about our society. And I don't only say that to the people in Beverly Hills, the mountains.
Well, you wrote a book called Bobos in Paradise. I'm wondering if you're talking about these people.
So those were people with 60s values and 90s money. And
right,
if you're in Santa Monica right now, you're surrounded by them.
You got it, yeah.
And, you know, that was such a product of the time. And you know, it's about anthropology, naming a clothing store after an academic department, and Sub-Zero refrigerators because zero wouldn't be cold enough. And it was an innocent period in retrospect. We were all a little innocent. It was, I don't know, California gave us a whole birth of consumerism, which was sort of pretentious and creative at the same time.
I said at the outset, you know, those people in New York, you know, they don't care about California. Do Democrats have to get better at championing local solutions as part of the effort at reparations?
I do think they do. I think it's a mistake for Democrats to think only in national terms, which is a tendency, and to think like the Green New Deal, forget what you think about it. It would concentrate, it would create, somebody estimated it would create 600,000 more federal bureaucrats in Washington. We'd have to build a bunch more Pentagons. And maybe in a society like 1932, where people had faith in Washington, you could do that. It just doesn't exist. You can't do social change unless you have some level of trust in a functioning polity, a functioning politics. We do not have a functioning politics right now. But I go around the country. I have a program called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And I've spent the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, in the old days before this, going to 3 states a week and interviewing community builders or interviewing everybody. I just come to believe in what you've done with your career. The interview is a very precious institution. Like, academics have all these studies and data. They don't get what you get from an interview.
Yeah, that's right. I found the same thing.
Rich. And so one of the things I asked, and that's why I was in Watson Compton, just interviewing people. But I asked people, to which level of society are you most attached? Is it your town, your state, your region, your country, the world? And 5% say my nation. And frankly, I would say that I'm most attached to my nation. But 90% say my town of Ontario, my town of McCook, Nebraska. That's where people feel attached. And that's pretty much these days the only thing they trust. And so you have to hand authority the thing they trust, because if you give authority to the thing they don't trust, you get all sorts of bad reactions.
Vice President Biden has said that he's going to put a woman on the ticket, but one of our listeners wants to ask, is there any chance that he could ask Governor Cuomo to be on the ticket?
He'd have to wear a dress. No, he said that, and I take him at his word. I'll leave it up to folks here in the Zoom room whether Kamala Harris would be a good pick. I didn't think she ran a great campaign, but I've been impressed by her demeanor before and after. And just her performance, her savvy, her intelligence. I must say Atlanta's Mayor Bottom is making a good case for herself these days. And Governor Whitmer, maybe a governor wouldn't be a bad thing. And if I was advising Joe Biden, and I must say I wrote a column when Barack Obama was in this stage in 2008, and my column was, I think, called Pick Joe Biden. I thought he was the right pick, because you want somebody and so obviously he took my advice. You want somebody
today then.
Yeah, well, I would say, think about it this way. One, it's going to be a divisive administration because there's going to be a left and a more moderate. Pick somebody of character who will not take sides in that fight, who will be on the president's side. So character first. Second, pick somebody who understands that we can transcend that fight. The fight between Elizabeth Warren and, say, Amy Klobuchar was over the events pre-COVID. Now we're in a different world. And maybe Bernie Warren wants to keep having that fight, but now the object is growth. What is the Democratic jobs agenda? It's not about breaking up this company or that company. It's about creating jobs. And so find someone who can help you move beyond what was the left moderate fight. And finally, just an administrator. Administration is hard. I would really love to have a boring administrator. I've come to like that type. And in Maryland, there's a guy, Governor Hogan, and he's like boring as the day is long. And but he gets the job done. In Detroit, there's a Mayor Dugan, I think, boring as hell. But if you want your lights put up, if you want your street lights on, he gets the job done. And so here's a city with 83% African American, some 65-year-old white guy saying, "You want the city to work? Vote for me." And people love him. And so I like boring administrators. I've had enough charisma.
Well, do you think that an administrator might be a really good idea, because Vice President Biden, A, hasn't done that much administrating himself, B, he might only be a one-term president, and you might want to have somebody there who can say, about whom you could say, this person can run the country.
Yeah, I do think our crisis is an institutional crisis. Things just don't work. And Biden is going to be great at legislating. He's a great legislator. I almost wrote a book about him about 15 years ago. I regret not doing that now. And he's just a good person at working the legislative process. So he's got that. But if we're going to have a series of aggressive policies if he's elected, and to create jobs, to do all this stuff, you need somebody to coordinate what's basically still a pretty fractious party and a government that's been hollowed out. And so somebody who could make the institutions work would be very important.
Do you think that the rise of tribalism and nativism have a relationship to the passing of the World War II generation?
For sure. As they died out, we became a more distrusting nation because they were so trusting. So every time we lost one of them. But I would say tribalism grows out of existential anxiety. If you leave people naked and alone, they'll do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They'll revert to tribe. And over the last 60 years, we let people naked and alone. And that's on economic terms. And secondly, it's on cultural terms. We've had a pretty good run of individualism in this life, in this culture, which says, I'm free to be myself. I don't have to look out for other people. I'm free to be myself. I want to put up space. I want to be liberated. All the songs of my youth, Freebird, Born to Run, Ramblin' Man. And we've sort of run out the string on individualism. And so we have to find ways to connect. But if you leave people alone, they will revert to tribe. And I think that's what's happening.
One listener wants to know, viewer, excuse me, what would you advise young Americans to do, young African Americans to do?
Well, I would urge them to have faith in our system, which is hard to urge them, especially like a middle-aged white guy. But I urge them to believe that we have this, even with this history of racism and the reality of racism, the reality of inequality, we have a lot of people rooting for them. And you know, my grandmother, this was back in the day when Jewish-Black relations were different. She was president of the NAACP, or our local chapter. And in those days, Jews and Blacks were really marching in step. And in the Jewish community, it's still true that we want to heal this. We so badly want to heal this. And there are a lot of people who don't know how to do it. There are frankly a lot of people who move to white school districts so their kids can go to elite schools. And there are a lot of people who just don't know what to do. But there's a lot of goodwill. And so I would tell them that. The second thing I would tell all young people is that the next 2 years are going to be hard. And it's an awful time to start a career. So don't start your career now. Spend 2 years doing something unusual, whether it's working on a fishing boat off Maine or serving, teaching English in Peru or going to Watts or Compton and volunteering in some organization. Do something that the rest of your life will say, well, that was a challenge. That was different. That made me a different person. And then in 2023, you can start your career. And I think it's useful to use the next 2 years just as a box, not part of the rest of your life, just as a discrete box, because it's going to be an awful time to get things started.
Let me go back to the viewers. Is Trump the evolution, I guess the next phase would be a better phrase, of Nixon and Lee Water type Republican politics?
Atwater. I think he takes it to a whole new level.
Did I say Lee Atwater, right?
Lee Atwater, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, some of that nastiness, what it began with them, a lot of the nastiness became from a large share of America that felt left out and looked down upon. And I've spent, along with my travels, I don't only go to Watts, I go to Trump country. Yeah. And that's a group of people who think, well, you don't see me. You have no notion of who I am. You think you read J.D. Vance's book and you think you know me. And I have to say, one of my critiques of the media is that among the top 10,000 journalists in all our professions, how many are Trump supporters? Maybe 10? And if you tell 42% of the country, we don't need to hear your voice, well, they're going to react. And I sort of think that's happened. We excluded them from universities, we excluded them from media, we excluded them from the coastal nonprofits. And after this is all over, when Trump's gone, including them is like an important thing to be doing. And whatever they'll say about Trump, which is sometimes harshly negative, at least he doesn't look down on me. At least he doesn't shame me. And so I do think we we have to still do a better. It's been an education for me to be around Trump voters, and I admire them more. I don't admire their choice. But there was one guy I met in South Dakota. He was like 75. And he told me about the best day of his life. It happened when he was about 35. He was the foreman of a plant that made fans for the go on top of buildings. And they upgraded the technology in the plant, and he could no longer manage it. He didn't have the skills. So they laid him off. And he just wanted to get away quietly. So he packed up his stuff in a box, and he opened his office door, and he was just going to walk. And there were 3,500 people forming two lines, a tunnel, between his office door and his car. Every single employee of that plant. And he walked through that human tunnel while they applauded him.
Wow.
And that was the best day of his life. And every job in the 40 years since had been worse. He'd gotten a worse job, lower money, less skilled. It's like, that guy's a jackass, but I got to make a change. And, you know, you spend time around that, you see why. I always say Trump is the wrong answer to the right question. And a lot of those people are asking the right question. And I have to ask you one question before we go on. Behind your head, I see Martin Luther King and I see Mahatma Gandhi. Is it, I can't see the middle person. Is it Abba Eban?
No, it is the Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama. Can
Yeah.
I tell you my Dalai Lama story?
No, please do.
I was seated next to him at a lunch in Washington, D.C., of all places. And he's a guy who laughs for no apparent reason. And so he just, you know, he didn't say anything profound to me the whole entire lunch, which is a disappointment. But he would just burst out laughing. And so I would laugh just to be polite, and he would laugh and I would laugh. And eventually I said to him, he had this canvas Dalai Lama bag. And I said, do you have any candy in your bag? And he pulled out the stuff in his bag. And it was all the stuff you get in a first class cabin of an international flight, like a little razor and a little eye patches and ear things. But he was like, just laughed. And I was always reminded that he's a person who just radiates joy all the time. So that's my one Dalai Lama story.
That's a great story and a wonderful anecdote. What about the Russian internet trolls and bots and the whole? I think the viewer really wants to know about more than just the Russians, but also about this disinformation ecology that you know, we don't see that much of, but that seems to be going on in a very vigorous way, very extensively, and being used very effectively by the Trump campaign.
Yeah, you know what the big effect is? People can dismiss everything they don't like as fake news. That they can say, oh, that's a Russian thing. Yeah. And that's sometimes true of Democrats. Susan Rice said some of the riots were Russian organized. I'm somehow a little dubious. I do think the Russians are out there, the Chinese are out there. What I don't know is what effect they really have. I mean, when you've been I was once the object of one of these stories. There was a long story, 3,000 words, and it was about me on an NPR show saying that Donald Trump should be assassinated. Now, I never said that, and the show they wrote about doesn't even exist. There's no such show. But it was a long, seemingly professional 3,000-word essay on this event, supposed event. And you think, wow, they can really just do that now. But I have to say, for the number of Facebook ads the Russians took out, I think are minuscule compared to the total impressions people had about the election. So I remain a little dubious they swung the election. But if the effort is to create disorder, it does sap at the basic sense that what I can read and see is trustworthy.
Somebody wants to know, and I'm glad this question is asked because I would have asked it myself if I'd had the opportunity. Does David really think that Trump does not look down on his rural, uneducated followers? You said that he takes them seriously or he doesn't look down on them. This person challenges that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I can't look into his head, but I think to Donald Trump, other people are either sources of discomfort or sources of admiration. They're not anything else but how does this affect me? And I think when he looks at the people who go to his rallies, I think he looks at them as people who are making me feel good because they're cheering me. That would be my theory. So I don't think he looks down on them. I don't think that's just not in his vocabulary. And so I don't think he thinks he's manipulating them. He thinks he's their God. And I think that makes him feel good. I really, we spent so much time writing about Donald Trump, and people want to read about Donald Trump endlessly. And I once said in a column, it's like 6 fireflies in this jar. What are we spending so much time on this? There's just not that much going on in there. And it's not like he's Nietzsche. But that is I feel like I haven't not learned much new about him in the past 3 years, except for that there's no bottom.
Here's a viewer who is worried about the coronavirus, I think, because the question is, what is the role of seniors in our society, especially during a period when we're hearing about herd immunity?
Yeah. I worry about this now. I mean, I would say in the first few weeks of the lockdown, I knew a lot of young people who felt, well, I'm not at risk, but I want to protect the seniors in our society. Yeah. And there was really a sense of like, I'm doing this for them, and I feel good that I'm doing this for them. Especially if you look around these days, that's waning. But this opening up is a complex balancing act, and how much we're going to create jobs for the young, how much we're going to create schools for kids. Are we going to have another year of online education, which is devastating for super motivated kids can do online education. 90% cannot. They're learning nothing. And so how do we make these balances between safety and life? And to me, there's no national answer to that. It's only local answers, because we don't have a national pandemic. We have a series of highly local pandemics. And so finding that balance is the collective action of community by community. But certainly the attitude that, oh, well, those were 100,000 deaths, but they were old anyway. That is a truly barbaric attitude. Among the other things, I read a study somewhere that the life shortened was 11 years. So that's real life. And plus life is just life. And we don't discriminate. That's like, well, this goes back to the sanctity of life in the Torah. Life is life. We protect life. And, all those who, are Orthodox and observant, everything bows down before life. Every rule bows down before life. And that's just how our life should be.
Here's a viewer who's keeping up with the news. Rod Rosenstein, formerly with the Justice Department, of course, said today, testifying before the Senate, that he would not have appointed Mueller to run that investigation today. Any thoughts about that?
Before and during and after, I thought highly of Mueller. I thought he was a credible person. And I frankly think we invested too much time in thinking about the Mueller investigation. I never thought it was going to lead to anywhere. But I can't fault people who know more, may fault the way the investigation was done. But I feel that he and the prosecutors around him did a credible job, and that's all we can ask.
I have a question. I don't have any more at the moment, any new ones. But do you think that Biden's connection or lack of connection to Ukraine is going to continue to be? Will it be used by the Trump administration? Will it have any force at this point, given all the other things that are going on that we've talked about up until now?
Yeah, I mean, no. I think it'll have another. I think that all stuff that's gone before. Some of the times when we talk about, will this affect the election? Will that affect the election? Well, imagine all those questions that were happening in January or last December, like blown out of the water by all these events. And so very few things, except for what happens a month before the election, affects the election. The big events affect. And so COVID affects, the Floyd killing affects, but the disorder affects. But almost nothing else aside from the economy will affect. And well, there are two ways to think about the economy. One is that we have a V-shaped recovery, and some people think we'll get a 26% or 21% growth. I think the Congressional Budget Office, 21% growth in the third quarter. But we'll still be down 8% because we had 30% decline in this quarter. And at a time when there's mass unemployment, I just don't see how incumbent wins that. especially when he's already unpopular. And so I think will be the climate of the economy, and there'll be this, and there'll be whatever happens in October. That part is unpredictable.
Do you have thoughts, I'm sure you do, about the course of the Supreme Court's future decisions?
I actually don't have thoughts about the Supreme Court. There are some things that I'm just not qualified to speak on, and legal affairs is you have to rope off some subjects because your brain can't handle it all.
There are a lot of subjects that have to be roped off, it seems to me right now, because it's difficult for anybody's brain to handle what's going on. And I'm interested in that context. In this, you work for the Wall Street Journal. What about the people who read the editorials in the Wall Street Journal? They certainly are part of the enormous money machine that is behind Donald Trump. How long are they going to continue to support him as this Mad Hatter's Tea Party that we've talked about continues?
I would like to know. I go to some conferences where the Republican donor class also goes, and I would say 3 years ago they were all anti-Trump, and then about 2 years ago they were like waffling, and then by last year they were all pro-Trump. And partly it was the tax break, probably.
Taxes.
Yeah, but partly it was like they're on the Republican team, and if the Democrats are attacking the head of the Republican team, they're going to be with the team. And so I really watched them move. They don't like Trump, but they don't like the Democrats. So whenever you ask them, what about this about Trump? What about this about Trump? They just say, well, what about Hillary? And you get all that whataboutism. Like I say, they're willing to be with him when it's a war and when they feel it's political war, but they will drop him as soon as they can. And the final thing to be said is, I really do not think money has a big effect on presidential elections. There's so much free media. Everybody knows who Donald Trump is. When you're spending more and more on TV and Facebook ads, you're just making the rubble bounce. And political scientists have studied this up the wazoo. It just does not have a big effect, especially on a high profile race like a presidential race.
Although a lot depends, I think, on how the race is covered by the media that are running the ads. There's no more time, unfortunately. There are more questions now, and I'm sorry that I don't have time to ask them. I just want to give you a chance to wrap up and say whatever you'd like to a very interested, very involved bunch of people who tuned into this podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful for everybody for tuning in, and hope my daughter who lives in Long Beach is somehow tuning in. She's been in the middle of a lot of rioting.
Yeah.
I cling to optimism. A lot of my friends think this is going to be just a terrible period, but I do think that the amount of cooperation we've seen is unprecedented. I think shifts in what government should do and what we should do for each other has been significant. I think awareness of racial injustice, bringing it top of mind and thinking like enough. I think that's real. And I think people in our business overemphasize the negative, because negative emotions are really powerful. We drive clicks and eyeballs. But I feel like it's exciting to live through a transition, and it's exciting to live through a transition which I think will put our country on a better course.
Well, David Brooks, we've been talking for a long, long time, although not so much recently. So it's great to catch up with you again, to see you and to hear you and be able to ask you some questions and get your answers. Thanks a lot for being on this Zoom, whatever it's called.
Okay. Next time we will meet on 3rd Street in Santa Monica. We will have a cup of coffee together.
Okay, well, we can protest, and that's a great place to do it. Great to talk to you, and thanks again so very much. And this is a virtual town hall. That's what I was trying to remember. Thanks to Janice Kamener-Resnick. Thanks to David Lair and all the other people at America at the Crossroads, a virtual town hall. Next week, it is David Frum and Peter Beinart from the Atlantic. Madeline Brand is going to be the moderator. I know her. Thanks to you all. Stay safe. Wear your masks.